Hey guys, D2 here with part 2 of my Hearthstone new format predictions series, I guess I'll call it. A couple things happened since I uploaded part 1, one of which I mentioned in part 1 that there wasn't going to be balance changes to Wild, but apparently that's not the case. One of the Hearthstone people, I guess, responded to someone in a forum and mentioned that they are going to be balancing Wild. So that's good going forward. Doesn't really change my prediction that the most competitive format's going to be Standard, followed by Arena, followed by Wild. But it's good to know that there's going to be balance in there. It's just not going to be all broken decks. Second thing is that Crip came out with a video, which was pretty good. I really recommend it. I'm going to put the link down in the description. And he talks about a few important things, namely that the removal of certain death rattles in the mechs obviously are going to make, decks basically weaker overall, and it's going to be easier to deal with things that are so sticky and going to remove, part of this Hearthstone annoyingness that's been part of our life for so long, right? Things like New Arena Egg and all that stuff. And it's really important to think about, right? Because as I was thinking about all these cards that are leaving the meta and, kind of being in despair over stuff like Belcher, Healbot, Zombie Chow, kind of, worrying for control, you have to realize that you might not need those cards quite as much with aggro in general getting weaker. And along those lines, decks in general don't have to be as strong as they once were. For the last several months actually, the decks that you played on ladder or in tournaments had to be basically broken in one form or another. There had to be some sort of sequence which was so powerful that unless your opponent had basically the perfect response, they weren't going to be able to deal with it. Obviously, Secret Paladin comes to mind, some things that Druid can do come to mind. One of the most obvious ones was, still is, but this used to be more powerful, is, getting Voidcaller into something like Doomguard and Mulliganus, which was very, very difficult to deal with, obviously. And so thinking about all of the different implications, right, it's really difficult. I was thinking about this for hours on end today, I'm not even joking. And that's one of the things that you have to constantly keep in mind, all of the different interactions of cards, and you start worrying about Belcher and Healbot going away, but then you realize because these cards are going away too that everything's going to change. So I'm going to actually keep it simple. In this part 2, I'm just going to be talking about the cards that I think are going to make, or the biggest impact cards that are leaving, and if they're going to replace, can they be replaced, what they're going to be replaced with maybe. And in part 3, I'll be talking about what decks are going to be going away, barring some sort of replacement in a new expansion for that card, or replacements for those cards, what I'm talking about. And before I get started, actually, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent just to explain to you basically the hidden implications of some of these things that are going on. This is a big tangent, so if you want to skip it, just click here. But this is the kind of things that go through your mind when you're thinking of all the different crazy things that could happen because of all these cards going away, right? And one card that came to my mind was Museum Curator. Now, Museum Curator is a card that's played in almost all control priests right now. But once you start going over, you think about all the death rattles are going away. I mean, Sneed is going away, Fugan, Shredder, Sky Golem, Toshli, Deathlord, Dark Cultist, Haunted Creeper, Mech Yeti, Zombie Child, all these things are going away. And it makes it so much weaker to actually play this card. I looked at all the cards that actually are left among the death rattles. I did this manually, so maybe I'm missing a couple here and there. But Leper Gnome, Loot Hoarder, Huge Toad, Harvest Golem, Bloodmace Thalanos, Karen, Major Domo, Sylvanas, the Beast, the Skeleton Knight, Abomination, Wobbling Runs, and Anubis House Sentinel are the remaining death rattles that you can get from Museum Curator, barring obviously some cards coming in new expansion. That's 13 cards left, and among them is one bad one drop, which, bad one drop from the sense of you're playing control if you're playing Museum Curator. 3 reasonable 2 drops, 1 reasonable 3 drop, and I'll get back to that later. 2 5 drops, no 4 drops, 2 5 drops, 5 6 drops, and a 9 drop. Right, so going over that. So, and the 5 drops, it's Abomination is like meh, Anubis Sentinel is not very good either. The 6 drops, Cannon Savants are good, the other 3 aren't that great, and Major Dome was pretty bad. So basically, if you're playing Museum Curator now, there's a good chance you're going to get something pretty reasonable. But in the future, it's going to be you play Museum Curator late game, and you're basically looking at Sylvanas or Karen, or you're, shit out of luck to curse on this video. And the bigger implication is that you can't play it on really two on turn two anymore. You used to be able to just play it on turn two and be like, okay, I have a very good chance to get a 3-drop that I might need here, and that removes the need to keep a 3-drop in your opening hand because there's a decent chance you get a Deathlord or a Dark Hold or something like that. Now there's only Harvest Golem left, and that means there's a 3 in 13 chance you're going to discover that card. And if you don't discover that card, you're going to play a Meteoric or 2-drop. You're going to wait until turn 6 to play Canner Sylvanas. You might as well just put those cards in your deck in the first place. So those are the kinds of implications that, you know, the removal of these cards will have. You know, these weird things that you don't even think about going forward. Let me just take a drink here before I move on. So, anyway, so let's get on to it. Before I start, I'm not going to be mentioning any mechs. There's no reason to, because, you know, what do you replace Goblin Blast Mage with? Well, you're not going to be playing mechs anyway, so why does it matter? What do I play Snow Trigger with? Doesn't matter. I'm not going to replace it with another mech because I would need all the mechs anyway. So there's no even point to talk about mechs. Just don't worry about mechs anymore. I will talk about the Death Rattles though, because obviously Death Rattles are still going to be a thing. But yeah, I split the cards into Tier 1 and Tier 2 as far as, you know, how good they were, what kind of impact they had. And keep in mind that this is as of League of Explorers. There are certain cards, for instance, like Void Caller, which used to be, I would say, Tier 1, but I bumped down to Tier 2 because recently it hasn't been getting that much play. Sometimes you see, you know, Demon Reno decks, but recently not as strong as it used to be. And so let's just get started in kind of alphabetical order, but not really. It's in Tier 1, Antique Healbot, Dark Bomb, Deathbite, Dr. Boom, Haunted Creeper, Implosion, Lotheb, Mad Scientist, Muster for Battle, Nerubian Egg, Pile of the Treader, Shade of Naxxramas, Shielded Minibot, Shield Maiden, Zombie Chow, and Sludge Belcher. Not really in alphabetical order, kind of. So, I want to talk about how these cards, if these cards can be replaced, or if not, or if they need to be. And the first thing I want to talk about are Dr. Boom and Pile of the Treader. And the thing about these two cards is they're just going to go away and no one's going to really, it's not going to really impact anything, to be honest, because they're good in both aggro and control. I mean, if you're playing Shredder, and as far as Shredder, you could just basically, you know, replace it with something like a Chill One Yeti, and obviously, even though it's not as strong, it has the same impact overall when you combine the impact from it not being control decks and not being an aggro decks. Like, for instance, obviously Shredder is so devastating when you have, you know, a 1-drop into a 2, into a 3, and then you play Shredder down. But it's still really difficult to deal with 1 into 2 into 3 into Chill One Yeti, right, from the control deck's point of view. So that's something to keep in mind. And same thing with Dr. Boom, right? I mean, obviously it's very difficult for control decks to deal with Dr. Boom, particularly if you don't have Big Game Hunter. But on the other hand, if you're an aggro deck and you haven't gotten in enough damage on the control player, and they place on Dr. Boom on 7 because they feel like they're at a pretty reasonable life total, that's basically a game over right there. You can't really deal with it either. So I feel like both Dr. Boom and Shredder, they were good for both control, aggro, you know, tempo, all that kind of stuff, that it doesn't really make too big of a difference in the long run. But I have marked off certain cards as being good, for instance, for control, and some are good for aggro. So the things obviously that are good for control are Belcher, Healbot, Dark Bomb, Deathbite. Notheb is kind of good for both. Mad Scientist is kind of good for both, but mostly for aggro. Muster Battle is good for both. Minibot is good for mostly aggro, could be good for both. Shield Maiden is good for control. I'm going to get back to that a little bit later. And Zombie Chow, obviously, good for control as well. So, let's start with the first one. Let's just start off with, what am I starting off with, actually? I'm going to be rambling a lot, so if you want to go, switch it to 1.5 times speed or 2 times speed or something like that. I guess I'll start with Dr. Boom, actually, since I've already have it written here at the very top. Dr. Boom's kind of funny because one of the reasons why it exists in general is because it's a 7-drop, and there's not too many 7-drops, and you might see Dr. Boom replaced by other 7-drops. I mean, I have some of them written down here. Obsidian Destroyer, reasonable. Fearsome Doomguard, kind of sounds funny, but it is a big guy, and it's bigger than any 6-drop out there, right? Guardian of Kings, now that there's no Healbot, that could be played as well. Chillmaw, haven't talked about this, but there's no dragons going away, so Chillmaw might be a pretty good card to play on 7. Baron Gen obviously is already out there, but you might see even more of it nowadays. Captured Warmonger, or sleeper pick for potential good card to play on 7. I have Professor Palestress in parentheses because it's not really a 7-drop. You don't really want to be playing, under any circumstances, Confessor on 7 without using the hero power, because it's just... it's so easy to kill, right? And so you want to get that value off on turn 9. So basically that's part of the power of Dr. Boom, right? Is that it was such a good 7-drop. It's just so much better to be able to play a 7-drop on turn 7 rather than, turn 6 you play a 6-drop, and turn 7 you play a 6-drop. It's not too great. So that's basically, what you're looking at as far as replacing Dr. Boom. You might just take out all 7-drops from your deck, or you could go with one of those things. It's kind of up in the air right now. And let's go on to Sludge Belcher. Sludge Belcher is an interesting one. I kind of mentioned it before. You don't really need it as much now that there's going to be less aggro, or less strong aggro, I should say. So you don't really need it as much, but here are some things you could replace it with. Send in Shield Master. Obviously the taunt, the fact that it's a taunt is more important than the fact that it's a 5-drop, right? So send in Shield Master. Twilight Guardian is a pretty big one. Again, that Dragon synergy. Dragons might be pretty strong in the future. Evil Heckler, now that the Shredder is gone, could be pretty strong. And then Sunwalker has kind of the annoyingness of Sludge Belcher. So does Master Jouster, if you feel like your deck can handle it and you feel like there's a meta that you can maybe win a lot of jousts. Moving on to Healbot, you can replace it with Refreshment Vendor. Tournament Medic might actually make a comeback. Part of the reason why people weren't really too high on Tournament Medic when it came out was because you might as well just play Healbot, right? That was basically what the argument was. Like, why would I play Tournament Medic when I can just play Healbot? And you might see that come back, right? Earthring Forest here, obviously, and Tuskar Jouster is something that might be just a standard 5-drop in, Paladin, which we'll get to in a couple seconds. Actually, we'll just get to it now. Why not? Let's move on to Loatheb. The thing about Loatheb is that so many decks played it, right? Control decks, aggro decks. It was just a really good way to either shut off a way for your opponent to kill you as a control deck, or shut off a way for your opponent to clear your board if you're the aggro deck. But now that Loatheb's going away, one of the things that's really big to think about is that a lot of players felt like they needed to have Sludge Belcher, Healbot, and Loatheb in their deck. Now there's a lot of space for 5-drops. For people that haven't played the game, since the very beginning, one of the biggest weaknesses of the early days of Hearthstone was that there were no good 5-drops at all, right? Actually, back in the day, Sylvanas was a 5-drop, so there was that, but then they quickly nerfed it before Naxxramas, I believe. So there were no 5-drops, and basically that was part of the reason why Druid was so strong, because they had Druid the Claw. It was so strong compared to every other 5-drop in existence. People were kind of resorting to playing, Stranglethorn Tiger, stuff like that. So now that all of these good 5-drops are going away, we're going to see things that haven't really been played before. Again, things like Dragon Consort, there's that dragon theme coming up again. And then Tuskar Jouster, you can just play it as a 5-mana 5/5, and if you get the Joust, then that's great, right? But now it's going to be a bit stronger because there's not as many great 5-drops out there. And I have Druid Claw written down here. It could be a bit stronger now that there's less good 5-drops. Harrison Jones is an interesting card because now that there's less strong cards, you can maybe get away with just playing it out in 5 and not be punished as bad as you would previously if you weren't playing against a class that didn't have, or if you weren't playing a class that had weapons, obviously. Faceless Manipulator is a card that was seen a lot in the beginning, but not so much recently. Nexus Champion Sarad is one. Stampeding Kodo, occasionally you see it, but you might see it come back as a way to deal with aggro. And also, Stampeding Kodo a lot stronger now that there's no, you're not going to bust any eggs open or something like that. And lastly, again, there is the Stranglethorn Tiger that you can use to, get a surprise attack. And not a surprise attack, obviously, just going to keep it very nice and safe as it's stealth. And I have Shredder written down here as well. I mentioned before that, you basically can replace it with anything. There's not going to be any far-reaching implications of Shredder being out of the meta, because you can basically just there's so many 4-drops out there. There's 3/5s, there's 4/5s, there's 5/4s, there's things with abilities, there's all that kind of stuff. I have a bunch of 5/4s written down here because of the fact that Shredder really just terrorized all the 5/4s, right? You couldn't play 5/4s because Shredder just traded with it way too well. So I have things like Savage Combatant here that could be really good because it has a pretty powerful ability, and there's no Shredder to kind of terrorize it anymore, right? Evil Heckler is another card that could be kind of a replacement, or depending on the meta, it's either Sentient Shieldmaster or Evil Heckler. If those cards are going to be playing. Spawn of Shadows? Question mark? Question mark? Maybe we see some aggressive phrase. I'm not really sure, but that's another card. That's a 5/4. Dark Iron Dwarf might see it come back. We've seen a little bit more in Zoo these days as well, and obviously Tomb Pillager might be even better now in Rogue that doesn't have natural Predator, and it's already being played. So that's definitely something to look forward to. All right, let's move on, and sorry, this is going to be like long and rambling, and there's no editing, so just apologies in advance. And let's go to Despite. Ooh, that is very painful for Warrior. Really, the problem is that they don't really have anything to replace it. It was so vital in every kind of Warrior, be it Patron, be it Control Warrior. There's King's Defender, which is basically an expensive Fire War Axe unless you have a bunch of taunts in your deck for some reason. So that's going to be very difficult. Obviously, there's Bash nowadays, so it's not quite as bad. There's also the Fierce Monkey, so it kind of dampens the impact felt by the Deathbite. So, Control Warrior and I mean, Unseeable Ghoul's going away too. We'll get to that later. But Patron Warrior is going to take might take a pretty big hit. But Control Warrior might survive with things like King's Defender and Bash and Fierce Monkey. But yeah, that's going to be a big pill to swallow, or tough pill to swallow, I should say. What is that phrase? Anyway, moving on. Dark Bomb. I'm talking about Dark Bomb and Implosion. Obviously, Dark Bomb is more of a control card, but losing both Dark Bomb and Implosion is really painful for Warlock, particularly Reno Lock, because those were the key kind of ways to deal with your opponent's board while you were setting up either your value minions, or you're setting up your OTK combo. It's going to be very difficult for them because they don't really have any single target removal. There's Shadow Bolt, which is there's Moral Coil, which is obviously very weak. I mean, it's a good card, but it's very specific in what you're trying to get rid of, obviously. And this Power Overwhelming. But going back to what I was mentioning before, you might not need such good removal now that there's less good options for aggro, right? Because before, things like Hellfire and things like Shadow Flame weren't always the best options because sometimes you're busting open death rattles like Nerubian Eggs. But nowadays it's going to be a lot more likely that you're going to be able to clear your opponent's board with things like Hellfire and Shadow Flame. So might not be as bad as it sounds at first, but definitely something that Warlocks are going to miss in that Dark Bomb and the Implosion. Moving on to Haunted Creeper. Haunted Creeper is going to be a bit annoying for aggro decks to replace. Obviously, it's played in bit control as well. But, yeah, it's just going to be hard to replace that annoyingness of the Haunted Creeper. So, probably just going to have to see a standard 2-drop in its place, which definitely makes aggro a bit weaker. And nothing really, I mean, unless they decide to replace it with more Death Rattles in the new expansion, there's no real replacement for it. Lothar, I talked about before. Going on to Mad Scientist. Mad Scientist is basically irreplaceable. There's nothing you can put in for Mad Scientist unless you basically make a new card for it. But there's no card you're going to put in for Mad Scientist that has nearly the same effect as it. So, obviously Hunters and Mages are going to suffer for that. Muster for Battle, such a good card that's going to be going away. And obviously this is going to be part 3 where I talk about this, but Paladins are going to take a huge hit because of that. And it was so good for both control and for aggro, right? It was really annoying for a control deck to deal with 3/1/1s on the board, and the ability for your opponent to kind of take out whatever 2-drop you put on the field with its face, basically, or with the Paladin's face. And for control decks, it was so good too because you get stuff on the board. It's basically like the Doctor 3, right? It's just this annoying board. It's both aggressive and defensive at the same time, which is too good. Nerubian Egg, there's nothing like Nerubian Egg in any of the cards, right? Unless they replace Nerubian Egg, it's just nothing that gets stronger after it dies. So yeah, it's not going to be anything but like Nerubian Egg. No real way to replace it. And rip Nerubian Egg. Rip really annoying Death Rattles. Shave Next Rammus is one that obviously really only Druids play. You see it occasionally in other decks, maybe like Oil Rogues and stuff like that. But you're not really there's no real replacement for it. But as far as Druid is concerned, there's no replacement for it being there and being this annoying card for opponents to deal with forever unless they have this massive AOE. But you can replace it with Mounted Raptor. It's not the hugest deal. I mean, if they don't nerf Druid pretty hard, then they're still going to be able to get along with Mounted Raptor. So it's not going to be too big of a deal. Minibot, again, this card is so good. There's no real way to replace it with any of the current options at all. There's just no way to replicate its annoyingness. I mean, maybe Argent Hearthstone, but that's not a 2-drop. The what was so powerful about it is the fact that it's a 2-drop and it trades so well with other 2-drops. So no real way to replace it. That's something that's going to be irreplaceable. Shield Maiden I have in tier 1, and the reason why I have in tier 1 is because it's basically in every single Control Warrior deck. But for instance, I saw Savitz playing with only one Shield Maiden in his Control Warrior, and it made a lot of sense now that you think about it, right? People kind of just got accustomed to the fact that you needed, 2 Shield Maidens in your Control Warrior, but really you don't need it too badly, especially with Justicar. So Shield Maiden, I don't think it will be missed quite as much, and you just put another 6-drop in there. Maybe you put some more health in your deck. You run 2 shield blocks. Obviously, some Control Warriors are running 2 shield blocks anyway, but there's other ways to heal, so it's not too big a deal. Now, let me just take another drink of water here. It's just tiring talking for this long. So, moving on, and these are the tier 2 cards that I listed here, and they are Avenge, Coghammer, Crackle, Deathlord, Duplicate, Echo of Medivh. Duplicate, Echo of Medivh, I've kind of parentheses around them. They're kind of tier 3 maybe-ish. Explosive Sheep, Fell Reaver, also with parentheses around it. Glaive Zuka, Dark Cultist, Kazan Mystic, also kind of parentheses around that. Quartermaster, parentheses around that. Light Bomb, Void Caller, and Mal'Ganis. And, it still goes on. Tinker's Oil, Unstable Goal, Unstable Portal, Valen's Chosen, Web Spinner, Flame Cannon. So, for obvious reasons, these cards can, for more or less, be replaced, so that's why I have them in tier 2. They're not as strong as the other cards. Things like Avenge, obviously Avenge is a really strong card, and it's what kind of makes Secret Paladin as annoying as it is, but I think that that's going to be less of an issue as much as, Minibot and Muster for Battle as far as the death of Secret Paladin going forward. Coghammer is actually a really big deal because it was actually a really good card, it's just that Muster for Battle was better. I've made this argument a lot of times in my casts, but if other classes could have access to Coghammer, they would almost universally run 2 of them because it's such a good card. And Coghammer would be a natural replacement for Muster for Battle once it went away, but since both are going away, it's really painful for Paladin. Kind of hard to find a replacement for that card. Argent Lance. But Crackle is going away, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think that I'll get to this probably in part 3, but Aggro Shaman is actually going to be pretty strong, one of the stronger aggro decks going forward, because Crackle doesn't really hurt too much. Power Mace wasn't really a thing, and you didn't always run the Whirling Zap-O-Matic either. So I think Aggro Shaman is going to be one of the stronger aggro decks because they weren't relying on those death rattles. Excuse me, can't talk, tongue getting tied. But yeah, they just relied on raw power, right? Which they're still going to be able to do going forward. That's kind of a tangent that I had. Deathlord, obviously pretty irreplaceable, but I've seen priest lists that don't run it. They can kind of get away without it, so I think they'll live without it. And Duplicate, Echo of Medivh, obviously irreplaceable cards, but they are in decks that aren't really played too much. That's why I have them listed here. They're kind of tier 3-ish because they're not always played, but in the decks that they are played, they're basically irreplaceable, so I decided to mention them here. Explosive Sheep, another card that's really there's nothing that has that kind of effect, and again, kind of niche decks, but at the same time, basically irreplaceable in certain decks. So, not too much of an impact on the meta overall, but for the decks that play it, it's pretty devastating. Fell Reaver going away, you can probably find a replacement for that. Well, the 7/4 that hurts you for 7, stuff like that. There's other cards that you can put in that are very aggressive, like Fell Reaver. Glaive Zuka is kind of a big hit to Hunter, just being able to, as far as Fate Hunters were concerned, as well as even, just having that extra utility if you're a mid-range hunter. Losing Glazuka is kind of painful. Dark Cultist is painful for the reasons I mentioned before. They lose Museum Curator, now they're losing Dark Cultist. Just a lot of things that they can't really run on 3. And Deathlord, obviously, losing Deathlord is not as bad, but partly because you could just run Dark Cultist instead, but losing both at the same time, that's kind of painful. So you might see Control Priest suffer just a tiny bit, but I'll get to them in a couple seconds. Kazan, long-time viewers of my stream know that I hate Kazan. And honestly, I think that Kazan's only place was in tournaments. I think basically you could run it as a way to counter certain players or certain decks that were in the meta. And even then, it was hit or miss, right? And I think that getting rid of Kazan will be kind of like helping the lesser players out because they were looking for a way to counter secrets, and Kazan just ended up not being a very good option, but they did it anyway. I think this is basically like removing the tax on the lesser players, just to be a bit harsh there. Light Bomb is a card. This Crypt mentioned this as well, but there's so many options in Control Priest, it's kind of hard to find room for all of them. So there's pretty good ways to replace Light Bomb. There's other options for Priest to go by. Obviously Light Bomb is very, very strong, but with aggro getting weaker in general, I think they'll get by with other things like Excavated Evil, for instance. Void Caller, obviously pretty irreplaceable, but again, just like a lot of the other Death Rattles, it's kind of nice to see it go, obviously. Mal'Ganis was a cool card, but obviously, made good by Void Caller, so not too big of an issue that's going away. Basically, the only reason to have it on here is because Void Caller was what it made it strong in the first place. Tinker's Sharpsword Oil, Crypt mentioned this as well. Basically, you just need to give Rogue a good card, a good weapon, or a good weapon buff, and they'll be fine. So it's somewhat irreplaceable right now, but I think it'll probably be addressed in the future. Unstable Ghoul, okay, this is where I talk about Patron Warrior. Losing two Whirlwinds like this, losing Deathbite and Unstable Ghoul, might be kind of the death of Patron Warrior, unless they give another sort of Whirlwind for Warrior to deal with. It's going to be really hard to kind of keep Patron Warrior going without that, but I'll talk about in part 3 a bit more. Unstable Portal and Flame Cannon, putting these two together, because obviously Tempo Mage doesn't really rely on mechs at all, and there are some Tempo Mage lists out there that didn't rely on secrets either, right? So the fact that these two spells are going away kind of is painful. If they get replenished by a different secret, or maybe they can just use the Arcane Blast or something, Tempo Mage might still work, but this is a slight hit to them. Obviously there's no real replacement for these two cards, but be interesting to see how Tempo Mage moves forward and if they get a replacement for those cards or not. Valen's Chosen, I think this is a bit of an underrated loss here, because that was basically one of the best. It was such an annoying card for Priest to have. Annoying for the opponent, I mean. And just getting that extra, getting the buff on the health and the attack and being able to kill something and stay really healthy afterward was pretty insane. You can turn, Northshire Cleric, and you can basically kill a Shredder with a Northshire Cleric and still have a pretty healthy body afterward. That was pretty crazy. Just all that kind of stuff that you could do with it. And yeah, it's just going to be a little bit underrated, an underrated miss for Priest, and it'll be interesting to see if they replace that. Web Spinner, it's kind of hard to say. It's obviously, right now it's irreplaceable. There's nothing you can play on one that basically replenishes itself later. But I mean, you might see Hunter still do okay in the future because of everything else getting weaker, and I'll talk about that later in the future as well. And that's about it. I have some random notes here that are kind of disparate. I have Dragons ! Written here because I'm excited about Dragons going forward. But yeah, I've been rambling on long enough. That is part 2. Probably not going to make any sense at all, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you look forward to part 3. And I guess I'll see you guys later.